Today we're stepping back into a world forged in iron and fire, a realm where power was brutal, survival was uncertain, and every day tested the limits of human endurance. Imagine a place where kings ruled with an iron fist, armies marched with ruthless precision, and cities rose like stone fortresses along the Tigris River. This was the Assyrian Empire, a civilization built on war, faith, and relentless ambition. Welcome to Why You Wouldn't Survive a Day in the Assyrian Empire of Iron, a journey into the heart of one of history's most fearsome empires. From the bustling streets of Ashur to the cold stone walls of mighty fortresses, we'll uncover what life was really like under the shadow of iron and fire. It's a world where gods demanded obedience, slaves toiled endlessly, and even the smallest mistake could mean death. So settle in, let your mind wander back over 3,000 years, and prepare to witness a story of survival and strength, where every moment was a battle, not just against enemies, but against the unforgiving weight of empire itself. Dawn of the Empire, origins of Assyria and the Iron Age. Imagine waking up at the edge of a river, not just any river, but the Tigris, its waters dark and churning with history. The land is hot with dust and old blood, cracked by sun and shaped by time. Before your eyes open, the air tells you what kind of day it will be, thick with heat, stinging with iron. You're in the heart of a world where survival depends not on kindness, but on cunning, steel, and the will to conquer. This is Assyria, and the Iron Age is rising. Centuries before the common reckoning of time, when most of the world still carved tools from bronze or stone, something changed in northern Mesopotamia. A new metal emerged, not decorative but deadly. Iron. Darker, harder, more enduring. It didn't shimmer like bronze. It wasn't used for ornaments or to honor gods. It was hammered into swords, plows, arrowheads, and shackles. It turned the soil for kings and spilled the blood of rebels. And no civilization wielded this gift or curse more fiercely than the Assyrians. Assyria wasn't born in a moment. It rose like heat from the desert floor, slowly and then suddenly. Its earliest roots stretched back to a city called Ashur, hugging the banks of the upper Tigris. At first glance, it may have seemed modest, just a cluster of sun-baked brick structures huddled against the landscape. But beneath that surface, ambition burned. The people here weren't content to farm and pray. They were traders, warriors, and priests. They watched their rivals, Babylonians to the south, Hittites to the west, and waited. When the moment came, they would strike. And when iron arrived, the waiting ended. To understand why iron mattered so much, you must step into the skin of an ancient man who lived before it. Picture yourself holding a bronze sword, elegant but soft. After a few blows, it bends. It dulls quickly. In battle, it's as much a liability as a weapon. Then the blacksmiths of the north bring something else, an unyielding black ore, pulled from the veins of the earth like fossilized fire. They heat it beyond comprehension, hammer it on stone anvils, cool it in oil and water. What emerges is stronger than bronze, sharper, harder to break. It is a tool. It is a weapon. It is power, concentrated and cold. The Assyrians were the first to understand that iron didn't just change the battlefield, it changed society. With iron plows, they could till harder soils, plant more grain, feed larger armies. With iron tools, they could cut deeper into forests, carve more stone, build taller temples and longer roads. Every blow of the hammer echoed in two worlds, one of peace and prosperity, and one of fear and bloodshed. The Assyrians didn't separate the two. From their highland fortress cities, they expanded like wildfire. Iron swords in hand, they moved south and west, toppling cities, enslaving populations, leaving behind not just ruins but warnings. Stone reliefs carved with scenes of battle and cruelty, lines of chained captives, cities burning, heads stacked like trophies. This was not a civilization that left you guessing. It was one that taught obedience with a blade. But iron brought more than warfare. It demanded new knowledge, new skills. Smelting iron was difficult, far more complex than working with copper and tin. It required hotter furnaces, skilled labor, and knowledge passed down like sacred lore. Blacksmiths were revered, feared even. In some corners of the empire, they were believed to hold supernatural power, taming the fire of gods. In others, they were simply indispensable, men whose hands could shape empires. And shape it they did. With iron, the Assyrians built machines of conquest, battering rams with iron spikes, siege towers plated in metal, weapons that could turn city gates into splinters. Their soldiers wore iron helms and scale armor. They trained relentlessly. They marched in ranks. And when they came as a storm. There was no escape. The Iron Age wasn't a quiet revolution, it was a roar. For the ordinary person, perhaps a farmer or a herder, the Iron Age meant something different. It meant the yoke grew heavier. Taxes increased as the empire demanded food and resources to fuel its armies. Iron tools made work faster but also harder. Your days began before dawn and ended in darkness. You lived with calluses, with fear, with a deep and constant knowledge that you were not free. The king's reach was long, and disobedience could mean exile, mutilation, or worse. You might never see the sword, but it shaped your life all the same. Geographically, Assyria occupied a land that bred strength through struggle. It lacked the lush marshes of southern Mesopotamia. Its rivers were swift, its summers brutal. The soil demanded effort. The gods demanded obedience, and the kings, well, they demanded everything. In return, they offered protection, law, and the promise that Assyria would endure forever. Of course, forever is a long time. But in their moment, the Assyrians believed it. They were the chosen, the hammer of the gods. They inscribed their triumphs on clay tablets and palace walls, in languages sharp as their blades, Akkadian, cuneiform, the script of empire. They built libraries, collected wisdom, and preserved the myths of Sumer and Akkad. They saw themselves not as destroyers, but as restorers of order. Every conquest was, to them, a divine mission, and that, perhaps, is what made them so terrifying. Their brutality wasn't random. It was methodical. It had purpose. It was ritual. They believed they were enacting divine will, forging order from chaos, punishing rebellion as sin. Their empire was not just a political entity. It was a cosmic necessity. So why wouldn't you survive a day in the Assyrian Empire of Iron? Because you are soft. You are used to laws that protect, to leaders who smile, to a world where power is hidden behind bureaucracy and handshakes. The Assyrians did not hide power. They wore it on their chariots, etched it into stone, screamed it from the mouths of kings. Life was cheap. Glory was eternal. The sword was iron, and iron never forgets. Life in the city of Ashur, the heartbeat of an empire. Before the sun crests the eastern horizon, a pale blush of light slips across the rooftops of Ashur. The morning air is still cool, touched by the night's lingering shadows, and the city stirs like a living thing. Chickens cluck in reed baskets. Merchants mutter to themselves as they roll up woven awnings above their stalls. A soft, rhythmic slapping echoes from riverbanks where washerwomen begin their day. Ashur, capital, temple, fortress, is awakening. Nestled against a bend in the Tigris River, Ashur isn't vast in size, but in importance, it looms over the Assyrian world like a beating heart. Here, power flows not just from iron and war, but from ritual, trade, and tradition. The city is both sacred and practical. It smells of incense and sweat, fish oil and roasting grain. To walk through its narrow lanes is to enter a labyrinth of sensation, where stone and spirit are woven together. From the river comes life and death. Cargo boats loaded with dates, barley, and cloth glide toward the dock under groaning sails. Water carriers in loincloths fill clay jars to sell to households farther inland. Fishermen haul in their morning catch, and among the flapping silver fish lie the carcasses of river snakes and twisted reeds. Children play near the edge, unbothered by warnings of crocodiles or illness. To live by the Tigris is to live with risk, but also with abundance. The architecture of Ashur is heavy and deliberate, shaped by the weight of history and heat. Most homes are simple: mud brick walls, flat roofs, a central courtyard for cooking and gathering. But the temples and administrative buildings are grander, whitewashed, decorated with glazed brickwork, and topped with crenellated towers. The ziggurat, though smaller than its Babylonian cousins, casts a long shadow over the city, a reminder of heaven's watchful eye and the gods' exacting standards. The marketplace is the city's pulse. Even in early hours it hums. Stalls spill into the streets, bursting with goods from across the empire. Baskets of dried figs, spools of dyed wool, goat skins, and tin ingots glint in the sun. There are Babylonian scribes selling tablets of legal codes, Hittite peddlers offering tiny charms, Elamite slaves traded like livestock. Language here is a music of mingled tongues: Akkadian, Sumerian, Hurrian, Aramaic, each syllable hinting at a different origin, a different chain of command. The city is alive with contrast: wealth beside squalor, sacred beside profane. In one courtyard, a priest reads omens from the entrails of a sacrificed lamb, his face calm as he probes for signs. Across the alley, a beggar with an open sore on his leg scratches at flies. Disease here is common, its spread inevitable. Water may be drawn from the sacred Tigris, but purification is uneven, and waste piles in corners where no one looks too closely. Children die young. Mothers carry herbs and amulets. Every cough is a question, every fever a gamble. Social order in Ashur is rigid, unforgiving as the stone that paves its temple courtyards. At the top are the elites, priests, scribes, and nobles whose lives are wrapped in linen, gold, and ceremonial duty. They live in spacious compounds with private shrines and libraries. Their sons are educated in mathematics and astronomy. Their daughters may be sent to temples or arranged in marriage like chess pieces in family alliances. Then come the artisans and merchants, the skilled hands of the city. They have more freedom, but they also bear more burden. Taxes are high. Guild rules are strict. Failure to deliver a promised item, whether a sword or a jug, can result in fines, public shame, even whipping. Every coin is counted. Every hour is spoken for. And beneath them, the laborers, farmers, and slaves, the invisible scaffolding of the empire. They are not nameless to their families, but they are nameless to history. They dig canals, carry bricks, haul carts, and clean latrines. Their backs bend not just from work, but from the knowledge that they cannot rise. One might rise in service to a powerful household, perhaps, but true escape from class is nearly impossible. And yet, Ashur breathes. Despite its hierarchies and hardships, it is not lifeless. It celebrates. Festivals bloom through the year, bright with drums, flutes, and dancing. The gods are everywhere, in carvings, in prayers, in the thick smell of burnt offerings. People laugh here, fall in love here, sing lullabies, and argue about debts. Even the lowest laborer knows the taste of dates, the relief of evening shade, the beauty of starlight above a quiet river. But the city is never truly safe. Beneath the rhythms of daily life, danger simmers. Crime is punished harshly. A thief may lose a hand. A false witness may be flayed. The Assyrian law is precise, written in clay and blood. Obedience isn't merely encouraged, it is demanded. To speak against a noble is to risk execution. To question the gods is unthinkable. To show weakness, even momentarily, is to invite ruin. Ashur is also a city under constant pressure. It is the administrative hub of an empire that hungers for expansion. Royal envoys come and go, bearing news of uprisings, border skirmishes, new conquests. Soldiers train in courtyards. Blacksmiths hammer out arrowheads and swords. The city prepares always for war, for plague, for drought. There is no such thing here as a quiet century, and you, a visitor from a softer world, wouldn't last long. The heat would suffocate you. The food, spicy, bitter, often spoiled, would curdle in your stomach. The noise, the hierarchy, the constant surveillance would erode your sense of self. Privacy is a luxury here. Your status is visible in your clothing, your speech, your scars. Every word you say might be overheard, judged, recorded. You would not understand the gods' names or the rituals to appease them. You would not know whom to bow to, when to remain silent, what symbols to avoid. And ignorance here is dangerous. You might survive a few hours, buy a fig, watch a bull sacrifice, listen to a scribe read a royal decree, but then the weight would fall. A fever from unboiled water, a misstep in the wrong street, a refusal to kneel fast enough before a noble's procession. And just like that, your life would be over, quietly, forgotten, absorbed into the dust and din of the city that does not stop for strangers. Ashur is not cruel for cruelty's sake. It is a reflection of its world, unpredictable, sacred, brutal, beautiful. Its people are not monsters. They are survivors, children of empire, raised in shadow and sun. Their hearts beat with fear and faith. Their hands build and destroy with equal skill. They believe in order, in purpose, in destiny, carved into stone. You would not survive a day in the city of Ashur. But for those who did, it was everything. The iron hand of war. Military might and psychological terror. You stand at the edge of a vast plain. The air is dry, charged, and the earth beneath your feet trembles. Not from thunder, but from the synchronized march of thousands of sandals striking the soil in brutal harmony. Dust curls into the sky, masking the sun, and beneath that haze, the Assyrian war machine is moving. Slow, steady, unstoppable. The Assyrians did not merely wage war, they mastered it. In an ancient world where conflicts often ended in negotiated settlements or seasonal raids, The Assyrians developed a different model: total war. Their armies were not ragtag militias assembled at harvest's end, but professional, standing forces, trained, supplied, and deployed with precision. From the 9th century BCE onward, they became the iron fist of the ancient Near East. And that fist did not hesitate. It began with the discipline. Assyrian soldiers were rigorously trained, segmented into specialized units: infantry, archers, cavalry, siege engineers. Each knew their task. Formations were drilled into muscle memory. They marched in silence when ordered, fought in rhythm, and retreated only by command. Armor of scale mail glinted on their chests. Bronze or iron helmets protected their heads. Shields were often curved and reinforced. Discipline wasn't a virtue, it was a survival mechanism. Their weapons spoke the language of the Iron Age. While enemies wielded bronze that bent or broke, the Assyrians gripped iron, harder, deadlier, more enduring. Spears, short swords, and arrowheads were forged not for elegance but for function. The chariot, long a symbol of elite warfare, was phased into a mobile archer platform. Eventually, cavalry, once a novelty, became a cornerstone. Horsemen could ride fast, flank enemies, and deliver fatal volleys of arrows into fleeing ranks. But it wasn't just weapons that won battles, it was the mind. The Assyrians understood something ancient and terrifying. Fear is a weapon, and psychological terror breaks resistance before a single blow is struck. When their armies approached a city, they gave no pretense of diplomacy. Scribes carved proclamations in cuneiform onto tablets: submit and live as tributaries, or resist and be annihilated. These weren't empty threats. The records tell us proudly, even boastfully, of cities burned to ash, of walls dismantled stone by stone, of fields salted so nothing would grow. Siege warfare was where the Assyrians shined. Their engineers constructed massive ramps of dirt and timber to breach city walls. They deployed siege towers, battering rams, and sappers who dug under fortifications to cause collapses. Archers provided covering fire while infantry advanced. No fortress was safe for long. If a city held out too long, it suffered more than defeat. It became a message. After victory, the Assyrians didn't hide the horror. Heads were piled in pyramids. Leaders were flayed and nailed to walls. Survivors were chained and marched to the capital as slaves, their homes razed. These atrocities were not uncontrolled outbursts. They were policy. The Assyrians documented them carefully, engraving reliefs of sieges and punishments onto palace walls. These images weren't for future historians. They were for enemies to see. Psychological warfare continued long after the battles ended. To modern minds, this seems barbaric, and it was, but to the Assyrians, it was also practical. They ruled a vast, diverse empire with dozens of subject peoples. Rebellion was a constant risk. By making examples of a few, they kept many in line. Cities remembered what had happened to their neighbors. When an Assyrian envoy arrived, many chose tribute over resistance. Fear kept the empire breathing. The logistics behind this terror machine were equally impressive. The empire built roads to connect provinces, enabling troops to move quickly. Depots stocked food and weapons. Messages traveled rapidly thanks to a relay system of runners and riders. Military campaigns were planned with the same care as religious festivals. Assyria did not conquer blindly. It mapped, strategized, and executed with cold efficiency. The king was always at the center. He was not a distant general, but often a battlefield commander. Kings like Ashurbanipal II and Tiglath-Pileser III led from the front, riding in chariots, overseeing formations, and praying to the gods for victory. War was divine. The gods sanctioned conquest. To expand Assyria was to fulfill a sacred destiny, and defeat was not just political, it was blasphemy, and the gods demanded blood. The Assyrian war machine Sheen fed itself on conquest. Provinces paid tribute in gold, grain, and slaves. These fueled future campaigns, financed construction, and fed armies. Without conquest, the machine faltered. Expansion wasn't just ambition, it was necessity. As such, the army was in a near constant motion, bringing ruin and order in equal measure. Now imagine you, an outsider, standing in the path of such a force. You wouldn't understand the formations, the flags, the drums. The noise alone, horns, shouts, iron on iron, would disorient you. You'd struggle to breathe beneath the dust cloud kicked up by marching boots. You'd panic at the sight of siege towers rolling forward. You might not even have time to run before an arrow found you. Even if you hid, even if you surrendered, you'd be at the mercy of men raised to see you not as a person, but as a threat. or worse, an example. And if you survived the battle, your troubles would only begin. You'd be shackled, marched hundreds of miles through blistering heat, branded, perhaps mutilated. You might die from thirst or exhaustion. If you reached Ashur, you'd be sold in a market or put to work on temple projects. Your name would be forgotten, your gods mocked, your home erased. But perhaps worst of all, your suffering would be celebrated. It would be etched into walls, preserved for eternity. A general would boast about how quickly your city fell. A priest would thank the gods for your defeat. A child, centuries later, would look upon the relief and see you, silent, bound, weeping, and learn what happens to those who defy Assyria. The Assyrian war machine was many things: efficient, advanced, terrifying. But above all, it was relentless. It did not stop to mourn. It did not hesitate. It did not forgive. You would not survive a day on the battlefield of the Assyrian Empire of Iron. But the empire would go on, until one day it too fell. But that is another story. From peasant to slave, the harsh reality of Assyrian society. The sun has barely crested the eastern hills, and already the village is alive. Not with joy, not with song, but with the quiet urgency of survival. You wake to the smell of dust and dung, the itch of a straw mat beneath your back, and the familiar gnaw of hunger in your belly. You are a peasant in the Assyrian Empire, one of thousands whose names history will never record. But without you, the empire could not stand. From the outside, the cities of Assyria gleam with power, walls stretching high into the sky, palaces carved with gods and kings, markets humming with trade. But behind those walls, in the fields and fringes of empire, the common people live lives that are brutal, fragile, and largely invisible. You are born into a station, and most likely will die in it. If you are a farmer, your world is the soil, breaking it, planting it, praying the rains will come. The fields are not your own. They belong to the temple, the king, or a local noble. You are permitted to live on the land in exchange for what it yields. That means a portion, sometimes a great portion, of your barley, wheat, and dates is claimed as tax. The rest must stretch to feed your family, your animals, and to store for the next season. The tax collector does not care if there was drought. He does not care if raiders took your grain. He arrives with scribes and guards, demanding records and measurements. If your yield falls short, you must pay in livestock, cloth, or your own labor. And if you have nothing, you offer your child. Debt slavery is not uncommon. A son may be taken to serve as a temple porter. A daughter may be forced into domestic labor for a wealthy household in Nineveh. You may never see them again. In the cities, life is no easier. If you're a laborer, you rise with the same sun. You haul bricks, dig canals, build roads or temples. Your hands are blistered, your back bent before your third decade. Artisans, metalworkers, potters, weavers fare slightly better, but still live under the looming shadow of the state. Royal commissions can bring wealth one year and ruin the next. One misstep, one shortfall in your quota, and you could be imprisoned or sold. Conscription is another weight pressing down. Assyria maintained a fearsome army, but it did not do so without cost. Men were drafted seasonally, pulled from fields and families to serve in distant campaigns. Some were gone for months. Others never returned. To serve was both a duty and a punishment. Failure to appear brought heavy fines or forced servitude. And when a man was conscripted, his family struggled, his fields untended, his debts unpaid. It is important to understand that in Assyrian society, freedom was not a guarantee. Slavery was not always about conquest. It was a consequence of life. You could be born free and die a slave, by misfortune, by debt, by punishment. Slaves performed much of the physical labor in cities and estates. They cleaned, they carried, they cooked. They could be bought, sold, inherited. In rare cases, they could earn or buy their freedom. But this was exceptional. For most, slavery was permanent, a status handed down through generations. The line between peasant and slave was perilously thin. A poor harvest, an injury, a misjudged word spoken to an official, any of these could topple your life into bondage. And once you fell, there were few paths back. Women in Assyrian society faced their own burdens. Most worked alongside their husbands in the fields or managed domestic tasks. In some cities, women engaged in trade or owned property, especially priestesses or widows of means. But for the vast majority, their roles were confined. Marriage was often arranged, and dowries were critical. A woman's worth was calculated in measures of silver, grain, or livestock. If a man grew poor, his wife might be sold to pay his debts. A woman without male protection, father, husband, or son, was vulnerable. The laws were strict, the punishments harsh. The Code of Ashura, older and crueler than Hammurabi's, laid out draconian rules. Adultery could mean mutilation. Theft could cost a hand. Disobedience to a master was grounds for execution. Even the whisper of rebellion brought death not just to the accused, but to their families. Fear, as always in Assyria, was the silent overseer. And yet, even within this grim framework, life continued. There were festivals, times when the gods were honored and people feasted. There were marriages and births, harvests and songs. People carved amulets for protection, whispered prayers to Ishtar and Ashur, and found comfort in familiar routines. Children played in courtyards. Elders told stories under fig trees. These moments were brief, fragile embers in the long night of toil, but they existed. Still, the empire asked more than it gave. It demanded your labor, your body, your obedience. It taxed your sweat, measured your worth, and replaced you when you broke. It celebrated kings in ivory and gold, while peasants died nameless in mud brick huts. And if you dared to rise, if you refused a tax, struck a noble, or murmured rebellion, the response was swift. Your house would be razed, your family scattered, your name erased. To survive in Assyria as a commoner was to walk a tightrope of compliance. Every day was a negotiation, with the land, with the officials, with your own aching body. There was no social safety net, no second chances. Justice favored the powerful. Mercy was rare. You who know comfort, who live with choices, how would you fare in a world like this? Would your hands know how to plow hardened earth under the beating sun? Could your back carry stone day after day on a state project with no end? Would your spirit endure knowing that your freedom could be stripped for a debt, a mistake, or a rumor? And if you were enslaved, could you accept it? Could you live your life under orders, with no rights, no voice, no future beyond someone else's will? In the Assyrian Empire of Iron, common folk were not the builders of destiny. They were the bones of the machine, replaceable, expendable, forgotten. You would not survive a day, but they did, year after year, generation after generation. They endured. The night comes, castle life and survival in stone. Night falls slowly over the Assyrian stronghold, but when it arrives, it does so with finality. The sun, a relentless force all day long, now slips behind the jagged hills, leaving a world of dust, stone, and shadow in its wake. The sandstone walls of the fortress, which shimmered golden in daylight, now loom as cold, hulking sentinels under a sky that is black, not blue, pierced only by the occasional flicker of a torch. You might imagine that a palace or fortress would be a haven once night arrives. Safe behind towering walls, beneath a roof of carved cedar, among guards and scribes and nobles. But in truth, night in the Assyrian world, especially behind those fortified gates, was a different kind of battlefield. A place where survival required not strength of arm, but sharpness of instinct. Within the massive palace compounds of cities like Kalhu or Nineveh, sleep did not come easily. The walls were thick, the doors bolted, but the air inside was stifling. Rooms, often windowless, trapped the heat from the day. If the wind blew, it did so with dust. If the candles flickered, they did so with the smoke of tallow or bitumen, not perfumed oils. The nobles slept on raised platforms, but lice, fleas, and the constant hum of flies found their way even to the highest chambers. Outside the royal chambers, noise echoed in waves, distant shouts from guards, the low groan of wooden doors shifting in their frames, the occasional crack of a whip as night patrols made their rounds. Dogs barked in the distance. Jackals sometimes howled beyond the walls. And in more remote garrisons or military outposts, the Fear-Me scouts or rebellious locals kept every man on edge. Within the fortress, every door had ears. Even in darkness, political intrigue simmered. Servants whispered, eunuchs maneuvered. Scribes copied sensitive messages by lamplight, and spies, yes, even here, listened through thin walls, waiting to catch a name, a plot, a secret worth trading. The powerful could not rest easily. Assyria was a kingdom of conquest, but that power was maintained not only through force, but through fear. Generals who had once marched side by side could become rivals. Royal relatives could become enemies. One misspoken phrase, one ill-advised alliance, and your name could be scratched out of the palace records. Your statue smashed, your children disappeared, your sleep interrupted not by dreams, but by boots outside your door. In some nights, the danger was not political but spiritual. For the Assyrians, the night was not just the absence of light, it was a threshold into the world of demons and restless spirits. The Lamasu, those winged guardians carved into gates and walls, were not just decoration. They were protection, inscribed with prayers to ward off the Lilu, evil spirits that prowled when darkness fell. It was said that certain illnesses came at night, as spirits rode the wind, slipping through cracks in doors or open shutters to perch on a sleeper's chest. Children were especially vulnerable. Mothers tucked them tightly under layers of wool and muttered protective incantations, ancient words passed down not through scribes, but through generations of whispered warnings. Soldiers stationed at night in the outposts along the empire's shifting borders endured a different kind of peril. With no stone walls, only tents or rough mud shelters, the nights were colder and the darkness absolute. The light of a torch could give away your position. The sound of footsteps might mean a comrade or an assassin. Men slept in shifts, armor close at hand, bows strung and ready. The concept of 8 hours of restful sleep, a fantasy, a weakness. The empire demanded constant vigilance, but even within the capital, even within the palace itself, there were dangers less visible, but no less deadly. Fire, for instance. The walls were stone, but the roofs, cedar, palm, and bitumen, burned with terrifying ease. A dropped oil lamp, an untended brazier, and the whole structure could be engulfed in minutes. There were no fire brigades, no water systems, just shouts, buckets, chaos. And afterward, blame. Someone always had to answer for the smoke that smeared the moon. There was also illness. In close quarters, with poor ventilation and standing water, disease thrived. Fevers came suddenly and often at night. The moaning of the sick, the coughing of the elderly, the sound of prayer rituals echoing through courtyards, these were common accompaniments to the Assyrian midnight hour. Doctors were called, but their treatments were a mix of herbal knowledge and spiritual pleading. Some patients recovered, many did not. If you imagine lying down to sleep in an Assyrian fortress and drifting peacefully off, you would be wrong. You would lie on a woven mat or animal skin, curled in on yourself for warmth. You might keep a dagger close, not because you expect to use it, but because it makes you feel less helpless. You would listen to the layers of sound, the muttering of guards, the scurrying of rats, the distant ring of iron boots on stone. Your eyes would not close fully. They would flick open at each new creak, each gust of wind that slithered under the door like a thief. Even for the powerful, the night was long. For the weak, it was longer still. You used to comfort, silence, and safety. Could you sleep under these conditions? Could your nerves endure not only the discomfort, but the tension, the suspicion, the invisible threats of betrayal, invasion, or disease? Could you fall asleep knowing that your fate could turn with a whisper in a corridor? That your name could vanish from clay tablets by morning? And what if you were a servant in the palace or a slave? Your night never truly began. You would rise to fill basins, to check coals, to guard doorways you dare not pass through. And when your labor paused, you'd find a corner of stone to curl into, hoping no one called your name. In the Assyrian Empire, the daylight belonged to kings and warriors, but the night, that belonged to fear. You wouldn't last until dawn, the role of religion, gods as protectors and punishers. In the ancient Assyrian Empire, religion was not a mere collection of myths or private beliefs. It was the lifeblood that pumped through every artery of society, a force so potent that it shaped kings and commoners alike. To understand life in this iron empire, you must first grasp the profound role that gods played, not just as distant figures of worship, but as ever-present guardians and merciless judges, whose favor meant survival and whose wrath spelled ruin. The Assyrian worldview was deeply cosmic and interwoven with the natural and political order. It rested on a foundation of polytheism, where countless deities inhabited the heavens, earth, and underworld, each with defined powers and responsibilities. At the pinnacle stood Ashur, the national god and divine embodiment of the empire itself. Unlike gods who represented abstract qualities, Ashur was intrinsically tied to conquest, kingship, and war, the very essence of Assyria's identity. The empire was his earthly manifestation. its armies his instruments. To fight for Assyria was to fight for Ashur, and to defy the empire was to defy the will of the gods. This belief system was not gentle or forgiving. The gods were protectors, yes, but also relentless punishers. They upheld cosmic order, known as Me, the divine decrees that maintained balance between chaos and civilization. If humans faltered, broke laws, or failed in their duties, the gods would unleash disasters: famine, plague, military defeat. This was not superstition. It was a harsh reality deeply embedded in the Assyrian psyche. From birth, an Assyrian was bound to this divine order. The moment a child entered the world, rituals began. Priests offered prayers and sacrifices to safeguard the newborn from malevolent spirits and to secure divine protection throughout life. Names were chosen carefully, often invoking the gods or their attributes, linking the individual to the divine from the start. Temples dotted the landscape, each a palace for a specific god or goddess. The towering ziggurat temples, constructed with precise geometry and colossal scale, were architectural representations of the cosmic mountain, a sacred bridge between earth and heaven. These sacred spaces were the heart of the religious world, centers of ritual, magic, and political power. The priests, an elite class, maintained daily sacrifices, interpreted omens, and guided kings in decisions by reading the signs left by the gods in natural phenomena, animal entrails, and celestial patterns. For the average citizen, religion was woven into daily life. Every home had its small shrine, where offerings of bread, beer, or incense were made to household gods. It was believed that spirits lurked in the shadows, ready to harm the unwary or reward the faithful. Protective amulets and incantations were common, warding off evil spirits and misfortune. But religion was not simply comfort or hope. It was also a tool of control. Kings ruled by divine mandate, claiming Ashur's favor to legitimize their conquests and laws. The populace was constantly reminded of the god's omnipresence and judgment through art, architecture, and public ritual. Palace reliefs depicted gods smiting enemies and punishing rebels, images designed to inspire fear and obedience. Warfare itself was sanctified by religion. Victories were attributed to the god's will, and defeated foes were often depicted as cursed or punished by divine wrath. The king, as Ashur's earthly agent, was expected to maintain order by crushing chaos, enemies, traitors, and disorderly subjects. Failure meant divine disfavor, a loss of legitimacy that could bring rebellion or destruction. The sacred calendar punctuated life with festivals and rituals designed to renew the bond between gods and humans. These ceremonies were grand affairs, involving processions, sacrifices, sometimes even human, music, and feasting. They served both spiritual and political purposes, reaffirming the king's authority and the social order. During these times, the veil between mortal and divine was thinnest, and the empire felt the god's presence most keenly. Magic and divination were inseparable from religion. Priests studied signs from the heavens and earth, interpreting eclipses, the flight of birds, or the entrails of animals to predict outcomes and divine the gods' intentions. Assyrians believed that ignoring these signs invited disaster. Every decision, from planting crops to launching military campaigns, was made with a vigilant eye on divine will. Fear of the gods' punishment influenced laws, social behavior, and personal conduct. The Assyrian law codes were filled with invocations to the gods, reminding citizens that earthly justice was but a shadow of divine justice. Crimes were seen not only as offenses against society, but as sins against the gods, punishable by both mortal courts and supernatural wrath. The gods also promised hope and protection. In a harsh world of war, famine, and disease, divine favor was the ultimate safeguard. Prayers and offerings were made not just to avert punishment, but to ask for prosperity, fertility, victory, and health. The gods were petitioned for mercy in times of crisis and thanked for blessings. For the king, religion was the foundation of power. The Assyrian monarch was not simply a political ruler, but a priest-king, the human link between Ashur and the people. His success or failure was read as the will of the gods. Every battle won, every city conquered, was proof of his divine mandate. Every defeat, a warning to repent and realign with the gods' decrees. The weight of these beliefs bore down on everyone, from the highest noble to the lowliest farmer. To live in Assyria was to live in constant awareness of a world ruled by unseen but very real powers. Daily life was a careful dance to honor the gods, obey their laws, and avoid their fury. Imagine for a moment waking each day with the knowledge that your every action was observed by celestial eyes, that any misstep could bring divine wrath not just upon you, but your family and community. The gods were not forgiving spirits of mercy, but stern arbiters of order. To survive, one had to live cautiously, piously, and with unyielding respect. Would you endure the burden of such vigilance? Could you navigate a world where faith was both a shield and a chain, where hope and fear intertwined? In the Assyrian Empire of Iron, religion was survival. To ignore the gods was to invite doom, and to serve them faithfully was the only path through a perilous life. In this empire, the gods walked beside you, watching, judging, protecting, punishing. To live without their favor was unthinkable, and to survive a day without their mercy was almost impossible. Women of the empire, strength and struggle behind closed doors. In the ironclad world of the Assyrian Empire, where war, conquest, and male authority dominated the public sphere, women lived lives often hidden from historical spotlight, but no less vital. Their existence was shaped by a harsh patriarchal society that dictated not only their roles, but also their survival. Yet, behind the imposing walls of Assyrian cities and the towering fortresses, women carved out spheres of influence, strength, and endurance, sometimes in quiet rebellion, sometimes in resilience born of necessity. Assyrian society was rigidly structured, and women's lives were tightly regulated from birth. They were first defined by their relationships to men, daughters, wives, mothers, and their status was often a reflection of their male kin's position. In a world where political power and military might ruled, women were generally excluded from direct participation in governance or warfare. However, that exclusion did not render them powerless. Instead, women wielded influence through family, religion, and economic activities. The lives of common women were dominated by domestic responsibilities. They were expected to manage households, raise children, and contribute to family economies through textile production, food preparation, and care of livestock. Yet this labor was far from simple or easy. The demands of daily life, fetching water, grinding grain, weaving cloth, were relentless. These tasks required strength, endurance, and skill, often performed under the watchful eyes of strict social norms. Marriage was central to a woman's life, binding her legally and socially to a husband and his household. Marriages were typically arranged to strengthen family alliances or social standing. Women's roles as wives involved obedience, loyalty, and the crucial duty of producing heirs, especially sons to continue family lines. Failure to bear children, or having only daughters, could diminish a woman's status and security, highlighting how survival was intimately linked to fertility and motherhood. Queens and royal women occupied a somewhat different position, though their lives were not without struggle. Queens were often the king's wives or mothers and served important ceremonial and religious roles. They participated in temple rituals, acted as patrons of religious institutions, and sometimes advised or influenced royal decisions. Yet even queens were subject to the whims of politics, with marriages serving as tools of diplomacy and alliances. Their power was both real and precarious, depending largely on the king's favor and the birth of male heirs. The sacred world offered women avenues for influence and independence. Priestesses and temple women held significant religious authority, overseeing rituals and maintaining sacred spaces. These positions granted them a degree of respect and economic stability uncommon for most women. Temples often functioned as centers of wealth and power, and women connected to them could manage resources and command labor. Despite these roles, the legal system underscored women's subordinate status. Laws regulated marriage, divorce, inheritance, and personal behavior with a clear patriarchal bias. Women had fewer rights than men, and punishments for disobedience or adultery were harsh and public. The threat of violence, both physical and legal, was ever present, enforcing compliance and social order. This legal framework was another layer of the survival challenge faced daily by Assyrian women. Yet within these constraints, women exhibited remarkable resilience. They developed survival tactics that involved negotiation, alliance building, and sometimes subtle resistance. Mothers, for instance, were fierce protectors of their children, advocating within family and community to secure their futures. Women often formed networks of support among kin and neighbors, sharing resources, knowledge, and protection in a dangerous world. Economic contribution was another avenue for survival and influence. Women engaged in trade, craft production, and market activities, sometimes independently. Textile weaving was especially important, and the quality of a woman's work could enhance family wealth and reputation. Some women managed property or businesses, navigating legal and social challenges to do so. The private sphere, home and family, was where women's strength was most visible but also most vulnerable. Household management demanded skillful balancing of resources, mediation of family disputes, and maintenance of social status. Women's health and well-being were fragile, threatened by hard labor, poor nutrition, and limited medical knowledge. Childbirth was particularly perilous, and many women did not survive it. The psychological dimension of survival cannot be overlooked. Women lived with constant awareness of social expectations, religious duties, and the looming presence of male authority. They had to cultivate patience, discretion, and sometimes cunning to protect themselves and their loved ones. The emotional labor of maintaining family cohesion and navigating power dynamics was immense. Religious faith offered solace and a framework for endurance. Women prayed to goddesses for protection, fertility, and strength. Religious festivals and rituals provided communal spaces where women could express devotion and find social connection beyond the home. These spiritual practices were a source of hope amid the uncertainties of life. Violence was a stark reality. Domestic abuse, political upheaval, and war all endangered women. Captivity and slavery were constant threats, especially during military campaigns. Women from conquered peoples were often enslaved or assimilated, their fates shaped by the empire's brutal expansion. Even Assyrian women were not immune to punishment or coercion, reflecting the empire's harshness at all levels. Still, women's stories in the Assyrian Empire are not only tales of victimhood, they reveal complex individuals navigating a demanding world with intelligence, courage, and tenacity. Some royal women left inscriptions and artifacts indicating their political involvement and religious devotion. Others influenced their communities in ways that official records obscure, but archaeology and scholarship increasingly illuminate. To imagine surviving a day as a woman in the Assyrian Empire is to recognize a life of vigilance, labor, and negotiation within a system stacked against you. It means understanding the balancing act between obedience and agency, between vulnerability and strength. It means seeing beyond the male-dominated narratives to the lived realities of those who sustained the empire's social fabric from behind closed doors. Would you find strength in quiet resilience or break under the weight of relentless demands? Could you navigate the double binds of power and powerlessness, faith and fear? In the Empire of Iron, a woman's survival was a daily act of endurance, shaped by society's harsh dictates, but also by the unyielding human spirit. The price of empire, taxes, tribute, and famine. The Assyrian Empire, forged in iron and blood, was not sustained by valor alone. Behind its fearsome armies and sprawling cities lay an economic engine powered by relentless extraction, taxes, tributes, and the harsh realities of famine. This machinery of survival exacted a heavy toll on the people who lived under Assyrian rule, a price paid in grain, labor, and sometimes life itself. At the heart of the empire's economy was the demand for resources to fuel conquest and governance. The Assyrians were masters of systematic taxation, imposing strict levies on both their core citizens and the multitude of conquered peoples scattered across their expanding domain. This was not a gentle process. It was a mechanism of control, coercion, and survival that pressed every village, farm, and family to its limits. Taxation was multifaceted. Citizens and subject peoples were required to surrender portions of their agricultural produce, grain, barley, dates, as well as livestock, textiles, and crafts. These goods supplied not only the royal court and administrative elite, but also the military campaigns that extended Assyria's reach. The burden was cyclical and relentless. Sow, harvest, deliver, and begin again. The capital cities and regional centers were hubs of tribute collection. Governors and officials enforced quotas with little mercy. Failure to meet demands could result in brutal punishment, imprisonment, enslavement, or worse. The fear of punitive expeditions by Assyrian armies ensured compliance, but at a cost that sowed hardship and resentment among the populace. Beyond the administrative cities, rural farmers and artisans bore the brunt of these demands. For many, subsistence was precarious, their own food supplies barely sufficient to last through the year. Heavy taxation meant little was left for personal survival, leading to cycles of hunger and deprivation. The thin line between stability and starvation was a constant reality. Famine was not a rare occurrence, but a recurring threat that compounded the empire's woes. Environmental factors, droughts, flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates, pestilence could devastate crops. When harvests failed, the rigid demands of the empire did not ease. Instead, famine spread, undermining health and weakening communities. The psychological toll of famine was profound. Starvation bred desperation and unrest. Families faced the agonizing choice of selling offspring into slavery, abandoning lands, or fleeing to uncertain refuge. The empire's military campaigns, while fueled by tribute, sometimes drained resources from the very lands they sought to control, exacerbating shortages. In response to these crises, Assyrian rulers sometimes implemented relief measures, stockpiling grain in royal granaries, distributing food to cities. But these were limited and often politically motivated. Relief was not a systemic policy, but a tool of statecraft to maintain loyalty and order. The empire also depended heavily on forced labor as a form of tribute. Conquered peoples were conscripted to build roads, canals, palaces, and fortifications. This labor was grueling and perilous, further stretching the limits of survival. Laborers faced exhaustion, injury, and neglect, their lives expendable in the grand design of empire. Trade was a vital counterbalance to agriculture and tribute. Assyria's position at crossroads of ancient trade routes enabled the flow of metals, textiles, and luxury goods. However, trade wealth was concentrated among elites, with common people rarely benefiting. Markets bustled, but for many, food and resources remained scarce. The empire's economic system was a paradox. Its strength relied on the extraction of resources and the subjugation of peoples, yet these very demands destabilized societies. Revolts and rebellions were frequent, as those crushed by taxation and famine resisted Assyrian control. The empire responded with overwhelming force, perpetuating a cycle of violence and suffering. Religious ideology played a role in justifying economic exploitation. The king was seen as chosen by the gods to maintain order, and tribute was framed as a divine obligation. This belief system intertwined survival with obedience, making economic hardship not only a material challenge, but a spiritual trial. To survive a day in this iron empire was to endure the harsh realities of economic exploitation, knowing that every meal was hard-won, every harvest fragile, and every demand a potential threat to life. It was to live with the constant pressure of taxation and tribute, to face the specter of famine, and to struggle against forces far beyond individual control. In the shadow of this relentless extraction, the resilience of the Assyrian people shines through, a testament to human endurance amid the harsh demands of empire. Yet for many, survival was not guaranteed, but a daily battle against hunger, hardship, and the weight of imperial ambition. The art of siege, starvation, disease, and psychological warfare. In the shadowed age of the Assyrian Empire, the roar of battle was often drowned not by the clang of swords, but by the slow, cruel grind of siege warfare. This was a war waged not only with iron and fire, but with time, hunger, fear, and decay. To understand why you wouldn't survive a day in the Assyrian Empire, one must grasp the terrifying art of the siege, a brutal practice that wore down cities and souls alike. The Assyrians were masters of siegecraft, their armies meticulously trained to encircle, isolate, and starve their enemies into submission. Unlike swift battlefield confrontations, a siege could last weeks, months, even years. Time itself became a weapon, and the city under siege transformed into a prison of dwindling hope. Imagine a city wall stretching high, its stone faces scarred by countless assaults. Beyond, thousands of inhabitants huddle inside, their numbers swelling with refugees from the surrounding countryside. The city's defenders, soldiers and civilians alike, prepare for a siege that will test every ounce of endurance. As the Assyrian army surrounds the city, the first tactic is to cut off all supplies. Trade routes are blocked, wells are poisoned or captured, and any attempt at escape is met with ruthless force. The city's granaries, stocked for peace, are soon stripped bare. The panic begins to spread. Starvation is the siege's cruelest weapon. At first, the hungry suffer mild discomfort, empty bellies, aching limbs. But as days pass, the body begins to betray its host. Malnutrition weakens muscles, blunts minds, and frays nerves. Mothers watch helplessly as their children waste away. The old and the sick, most vulnerable of all, perish quietly. Food becomes more than nourishment. It becomes currency, bargaining chips in a desperate game. Rich or poor, all are affected. Those with means hoard precious grains or animals, while the masses scavenge whatever scraps remain, roots, bark, even leather softened in water. In some tragic accounts, hunger forced families to turn to cannibalism, a taboo born of ultimate desperation. But starvation is only one aspect of siege warfare. Disease follows swiftly behind hunger's weakening hand. Sanitation inside besieged cities collapses as corpses pile up and clean water runs scarce. Cholera, dysentery, and typhus spread like wildfire through cramped, unsanitary quarters. The stench of death hangs thick, and every cough or fever portends a new loss. Medical knowledge was limited, and remedies often relied on superstition or divine intervention. Physicians and priests worked tirelessly, but their efforts could scarcely stem the tide of illness. Panic and despair rippled through the population as neighbors succumbed one after another. Psychological warfare compounded these horrors. The Assyrians, aware that fear could weaken resistance as surely as hunger, employed tactics designed to break the spirit. They crafted terrifying siege engines and battering rams, their sounds echoing ominously against the city walls. The soldiers shouted curses and threats, their war cries aimed not only at enemies, but at hope itself. Sometimes the Assyrians paraded captives, former enemies, or their own slaves, before the walls as grim reminders of what awaited those who resisted. They sent messages promising mercy for surrender or horrific punishment for defiance, sowing doubt among the besieged. The city's leaders faced impossible choices. Should they attempt a breakout and risk slaughter? Should they surrender and face uncertain fates as captives or slaves? Or should they endure, hoping for relief forces that might never come? These questions haunted every night, eroding resolve. Within the walls, social order strained under the pressure. Food hoarding led to suspicion and violence. Families turned against neighbors, thieves flourished, and the once unified populace fragmented. Morale, a fragile thing in peacetime, frayed into despair and madness. For the Assyrian army, patience was key. They did not rush the siege, but maintained unyielding pressure. This tactic minimized their own casualties, avoiding costly assaults that could drain the empire's strength. Instead, they trusted time and terror to wear down their enemies. The eventual fall of a city was often marked by chaos and carnage. Once the walls were breached or gates forced open, Assyrian soldiers poured in, exacting vengeance. Captives were enslaved, leaders executed, and the city's riches plundered. Survivors faced exile or death, their homes razed to deter future resistance. The legacy of Assyrian siege warfare is a testament to a brutal strategy that prioritized psychological and logistical domination as much as physical conquest. For those trapped inside, survival was a fleeting hope, and the siege was a slow descent into suffering. This method of warfare was part of the empire's iron grip on the ancient Near East, reflecting its ruthless pragmatism. The Assyrians understood that power lay not only in the sword, but in controlling minds and resources. The siege was a chilling example of that principle in action. To live even a single day under siege was to confront the limits of human endurance and will. Hunger gnawed at the body, disease attacked from within, and terror wore down the spirit. The city was a crucible, and many who entered would never leave unchanged, if they left at all. Understanding this dark facet of Assyrian power reveals why survival in their empire was so precarious. It was not only the battlefield that threatened life, but the long, harrowing siege, a test of patience, suffering, and ultimately the will to live. Children in the empire, growing up under iron. To truly understand why you wouldn't survive a day in the Assyrian Empire of Iron, it's essential to peer through the eyes of its youngest inhabitants. Childhood in Assyria was a time sharply divided by class, a period marked as much by harsh realities as by the fragile hopes of youth. For the empire's children, life was a slow, arduous climb, shaped by survival, education, and endless work. Imagine a boy or girl born into an Assyrian family living near the capital city of Ashur or one of the smaller provincial towns. From the moment they took their first breath, their future was inscribed by the rigid structures of society. Here, childhood was no innocent season of carefree play. It was a prelude to the lifelong struggle to endure. The children of the elite, sons and daughters of the king, high priests, and wealthy merchants, were raised with a sense of purpose and power. Their upbringing was carefully managed by tutors and servants, for education was not a luxury but a strategic necessity. Boys learned the sacred art of cuneiform writing, mastering the complex wedge-shaped script that recorded the empire's laws, trade agreements, and royal decrees. They studied mathematics, astronomy, and religious texts, all designed to prepare them for roles as scribes and administrators or military officers. Girls of the elite, meanwhile, received instruction in household management, religious rituals, and sometimes music or weaving, skills to enhance their value in marriage alliances and social standing. Their education, while narrower, was deeply woven into the cultural fabric of Assyria, a tool to maintain the family's honor and influence. But for the majority, the children of farmers, laborers, and slaves, education was a distant dream. Their days were dominated by relentless labor, often beginning before dawn. From an early age, children learned to carry burdens, tend livestock, gather firewood, and assist in the endless tasks required to keep their families alive. Childhood, in this sense, was brief. The transition to adulthood was measured not by age, but by responsibility. In rural villages, boys followed their fathers into the fields, learning the rhythms of sowing, harvesting, and irrigation that sustained the empire's food supply. Girls helped their mothers grind grain, weave cloth, and care for younger siblings. Every task was essential, every moment a lesson in survival. Danger was ever present. The empire's harsh climate and seasonal floods made farming precarious. Disease could strike at any time, claiming young lives with frightening swiftness. Children were especially vulnerable to infections like dysentery, malnutrition, and respiratory illnesses. Medical care, rudimentary at best, often failed them. But threats came not only from nature. The political and military turmoil of the age cast a long shadow over childhood. The constant need for soldiers meant that boys could be conscripted as soon as they were able to bear arms, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. These youths were thrust into brutal training regimes, preparing to fight in campaigns that demanded both discipline and ruthless obedience. The ever-present threat of warfare and enslavement also shaped family life. Parents lived with the fear that their children might be taken as prisoners during raids or forced into servitude. This fear was etched deeply into the collective consciousness, shaping how families raised and protected their young. Despite this, moments of play and joy were not entirely absent. Archaeologists have uncovered toys such as dolls, spinning tops, and miniature weapons made from clay or wood. These fragments hint at children's attempts to carve out spaces of normalcy amid hardship. But such moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the pressing demands of survival. Religious instruction played a crucial role in children's lives, especially among the elite, but also permeating common families. From a young age, children learned prayers and rituals aimed at appeasing the gods and securing protection. Temples and shrines were central to communal life, and children were often present during festivals and ceremonies. The belief that divine favor could safeguard their futures was a fragile but vital hope. The legal framework of the empire also touched childhood. Assyrian laws detailed harsh punishments for disobedience, theft, or disrespect, even among children. Corporal punishment was common, reinforcing the strict social order and obedience to authority from an early age. Health and nutrition were uneven, depending largely on social status. While elite children might enjoy richer foods and medical attention, most children subsisted on simple diets of barley, lentils, and vegetables, often inadequate for proper growth. Hunger and malnutrition remained constant risks. Through it all, family bonds provided a measure of resilience. Stories, songs, and oral traditions passed from parent to child helped maintain a sense of identity and hope. Even in a world ruled by iron and fear, the small acts of care and teaching were threads of continuity. To grow up in the Assyrian Empire was to navigate a world fraught with hardship and danger, where every day was a test of endurance and every step toward adulthood was weighted with expectation. It was a life where the dreams of childhood were often tempered by the harsh realities of empire. Understanding the experiences of Assyrian children reveals the empire's relentless grip on all aspects of life. From the cradle to the battlefield, survival depended on obedience, strength, and faith. It was a childhood shadowed by the empire's iron hand, a world where the faintest hope was often overshadowed by the certainty of struggle. This reflection on childhood under Assyrian rule reminds us that history's greatest empires were built not only on the shoulders of kings and warriors, but also on the backs of countless children, learning, laboring, and fighting to live another day. The Assyrian kings: power, paranoia, and propaganda. In the Assyrian Empire of Iron, power was concentrated in the hands of kings who ruled with an iron fist and an ever-watchful eye. Their lives were a complex weave of divine right, absolute authority, and a pervasive sense of paranoia that colored every decision. To understand why survival was so precarious, we must peer into the minds and courts of these rulers, men who wielded immense power but lived in constant fear. The Assyrian king was not merely a political leader. He was the living representative of the gods on earth, particularly Ashur, the chief deity of the empire. This divine status was a double-edged sword. It granted the king unquestionable authority, yet bound him to the weight of cosmic responsibility. His success or failure was believed to reflect the favor or wrath of the gods, a belief that shaped the brutal, high-stakes atmosphere of his reign. From the moment he ascended the throne, the king's world was one of suspicion and vigilance. Assyrian kings lived surrounded by courtiers, generals, priests, and spies, all seeking favor, protection, or power. The political landscape was treacherous, rife with conspiracies and rivalries. Paranoia was not a sign of weakness, but a survival strategy, a necessary vigilance in a world where betrayal could come from even the closest confidants. Kings maintained their grip on power through a mix of calculated terror and propaganda. Public displays of brutality were common, a stark reminder to both enemies and subjects that dissent would be met with ruthless punishment. Carvings and inscriptions on palace walls depicted graphic scenes of warfare, executions, and divine wrath, reinforcing the king's image as a fearsome and unstoppable force. Propaganda was carefully crafted and omnipresent. Royal inscriptions often portrayed the king as a mighty warrior favored by the gods, a bringer of order to a chaotic world. These narratives were essential in legitimizing his rule and intimidating potential challengers. The king's word was law, and this was reinforced through ritual, ceremony, and spectacle. Yet beneath this formidable facade lay the psychological toll of ruling such an empire. The constant pressure to maintain control, expand territory, and appease the gods bred an atmosphere of relentless stress. Assyrian kings were known to consult oracles and astrologers obsessively, seeking signs and warnings. Dreams and omens were scrutinized for hidden threats or divine commands. This climate of fear extended to the royal family itself. Succession was often fraught with danger, as princes and rivals plotted to seize the throne. Assassinations, palace coups, and purges were common. The king's paranoia was fueled by real threats, making the palace a gilded cage where loyalty was fragile and trust scarce. Despite this, the king was expected to embody strength, wisdom, and piety. His military campaigns were central to his legitimacy. Success on the battlefield proved his divine favor and justified his rule. Victories brought tribute, slaves, and prestige, while defeats risked undermining his authority and inviting rebellion. Kings were also patrons of grand building projects, temples, palaces, and city walls, which served both practical and symbolic purposes. These monuments were physical manifestations of power and divine sanction, designed to awe subjects and enemies alike. The king's inscriptions would boast of these achievements, immortalizing his reign in stone. However, this quest for power came at a cost to the people. Resources were drained to fund wars and construction, taxes soared, and the empire's brutal military campaigns inflicted suffering across the lands. The king's paranoia and need for control often translated into harsher laws, increased conscription, and severe punishments. To survive under the Assyrian kings was to navigate a world dominated by fear and spectacle, where loyalty was demanded but rarely guaranteed. It was a world where power was absolute but precarious, and where the line between ruler and prisoner was often blurred. In this harsh environment, the king's psychological landscape, shaped by paranoia, propaganda, and the relentless demands of power, was both a cause and consequence of the empire's iron grip. Understanding this complex dynamic helps us grasp why life in the Assyrian Empire was so unforgiving, why survival was a daily challenge, and why the shadow of the king loomed over every aspect of existence. Assyrian medicine and healing, between science and superstition. In the vast expanse of the Assyrian Empire, survival was a delicate balance, not only against enemies and famine, but also against the unseen forces of disease and sickness. Assyrian medicine stood at a crossroads of early science and deep-rooted superstition, where the physical and the spiritual were inseparably entwined. To understand why a single illness could spell disaster, we must walk through the shadowed corridors of Assyrian healing, where doctors, priests, and sorcerers all played vital roles in a society desperate to keep the body and soul intact. Illness in Assyria was never seen purely as a physical ailment. The ancient Assyrians believed that sickness was often a manifestation of divine punishment or malevolent spirits invading the body. Diseases were attributed to angry gods, vengeful demons, or curses cast by enemies. This belief profoundly shaped their approach to medicine, where rituals and incantations stood alongside herbal remedies and surgical procedures. The healers, known as Asu, were more than mere doctors. They were priests and magicians, practitioners who straddled the realms of science and the supernatural. Their training combined knowledge of anatomy and remedies with sacred rites designed to appease gods or expel evil forces. This blend reflected the Assyrian understanding of the human being as a complex union of body, mind, and spirit. Physical treatments were surprisingly advanced for their time. Archaeological finds reveal surgical instruments such as scalpels and probes, suggesting that Assyrian healers performed procedures ranging from wound care to draining abscesses. They utilized a variety of natural substances, herbs, resins, and minerals to treat ailments. Some remedies were practical, such as poultices for infections or honey for its antibacterial properties, while others were based on ritual purity and symbolic meaning. Yet alongside these practical treatments, magic and prayer were essential components of healing. Priests performed elaborate ceremonies, chanting incantations to invoke protection or drive out evil spirits. Amulets, carved with divine symbols or protective inscriptions, were commonly worn or placed near the sick to ward off harm. The boundary between medical treatment and spiritual intervention was fluid, reflecting a worldview where health was a gift from the gods and illness a sign of cosmic imbalance. The Assyrian texts, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, provide fascinating insights into their medical knowledge. They describe symptoms, diagnoses, and prescriptions in meticulous detail, blending empirical observation with mythic interpretation. For example, fever might be recognized as a symptom of infection, but it was also linked to the presence of a specific demon. Treatment, therefore, involved both administering herbs and performing rituals to expel the spirit. The dangers of illness were magnified by the empire's dense urban centers and military campaigns. Disease spread rapidly in crowded cities like Nineveh and Ashur, where sanitation was limited and clean water scarce. Soldiers living in close quarters faced wounds that could easily become infected without effective treatment. Epidemics were feared as signs of divine displeasure that could undermine the very stability of the empire. Women played a crucial role in Assyrian healing as well. Midwives and female healers provided care during childbirth, a perilous time when both mother and child faced high mortality rates. They employed herbal medicines and charms, combining practical knowledge with spiritual protection. Childbirth complications were often interpreted as a spiritual crisis, requiring the intervention of both medicine and ritual. Mental health, too, was understood in spiritual terms. Conditions we might now classify as psychological or neurological were seen as possession or influenced by spirits. Treatments might involve exorcisms or prayers, highlighting the holistic nature of Assyrian healing, a system where body and soul could not be separated. Despite the impressive array of knowledge and practices, survival was never guaranteed. Without antibiotics or modern sanitation, infections and diseases that we now treat easily could be deadly. The ever-present threat of illness added to the daily hardships faced by all classes, from king to commoner. The Assyrian approach to medicine reveals a civilization striving to impose order on the chaos of sickness through a combination of observation, faith, and ritual. It is a poignant reminder that in the Empire of Iron, health was fragile, and survival demanded not only physical strength, but also spiritual resilience, clean and ready. The roads of empire, trade, communication, and control. Stretching across rugged mountains, vast deserts, and fertile plains, the roads of the Assyrian Empire were the arteries of a powerful civilization. These routes stitched together a vast and diverse empire, connecting distant cities, military outposts, and conquered territories. But traversing these roads was no simple journey. They carried not only goods and messages, but also the weight of imperial control and the ever-present risk of danger. At its height, the Assyrian Empire extended over modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and beyond. To maintain such a sprawling domain, the Assyrians invested heavily in building and maintaining roads. These roads were not mere dirt tracks. Many were carefully engineered, widened, and cleared of obstacles to accommodate caravans, chariots, and armies moving swiftly across the landscape. The royal road network allowed messages to travel surprisingly fast for the time. Couriers rode on horseback or by chariot, carrying letters, orders, and reports between the king's palace in Nineveh or Ashur and the farthest reaches of the empire. The flow of information was critical. A delayed message could mean a missed opportunity or a failed campaign. Along these roads, Assyrian governors established fortified way stations, small military outposts and rest stops where travelers could find protection, food, and fresh horses. These stations also served as checkpoints to monitor movement and collect tolls or taxes, reinforcing the empire's grip on its subjects. Yet the roads were fraught with peril. Bandits and rebels lurked in the shadows, preying on merchants and couriers. The vast open landscapes offered little refuge for the unwary. Travelers risked robbery, ambush, and kidnapping. The Assyrian military, renowned for its discipline and brutality, was often dispatched to patrol key routes and hunt down threats, but the vastness of the empire made total security impossible. Trade caravans carried precious goods, textiles, spices, metals, and crafted items, vital to the empire's wealth and influence. These goods fueled the economy and fed the luxury desires of the elite. However, every journey demanded vigilance. A lost shipment could devastate a merchant's livelihood, and a caravan's failure could ripple through the empire's economy. Communication over these roads was more than just practical. It was an exercise in power. The ability to send orders and receive news allowed the Assyrian kings to govern distant lands with authority. Their messages were often sealed with royal insignia, symbolizing the divine sanction behind the empire's rule. The roads were thus a physical and symbolic manifestation of imperial might. For ordinary people, the roads were also a source of anxiety. The arrival of soldiers or tax collectors could mean conscription, forced labor, or increased tribute demands. The roads brought the empire's reach deep into daily life, a reminder that no place was truly remote or beyond control. Environmental challenges added to the hardship of travel. Harsh sun, dust storms, and sudden rains transformed roads into treacherous paths. Travelers needed not only physical endurance, but knowledge of the terrain and seasons. Many perished from dehydration, exposure, or accidents. The Assyrian roads also carried culture and ideas. Merchants, soldiers, and officials moving through the empire facilitated the exchange of languages, religious beliefs, and customs. This cultural flow helped knit the diverse peoples of the empire together, though often under the shadow of Assyrian dominance. Yet, despite their critical importance, these roads were not places of comfort. Travelers faced long days under the scorching sun or freezing nights in open terrain. Food and water were precious commodities. Rest was rare and often uneasy, given the threat of attacks. To survive on the roads required more than luck. Travelers often journeyed in groups, guarded by armed escorts. Merchants hired guards to protect their valuable cargo. Travelers learned to read signs of danger, from the behavior of animals to traces of recent footsteps. Trust was rare, and strangers were viewed with suspicion. The roads were also places of stories. whispered tales of miraculous escapes, brutal attacks, and secret meetings. They were the veins through which the lifeblood of the empire pulsed, but also the veins vulnerable to infection. For the Assyrians, the road network was a masterpiece of organization and control, but for those who traveled it daily, survival depended on constant vigilance, strength, and sometimes sacrifice. In the end, these roads were more than routes for commerce and communication. They were the spine of an empire built on iron and fear. They allowed Assyria to extend its power, but also served as a reminder that life in the empire was a continuous journey through danger, a journey few could endure unscathed. Slaves and prisoners, lives bound by chains. In the vast and relentless machinery of the Assyrian Empire, there existed a hidden but indispensable population. Those who lived not as free men and women, but as slaves and prisoners, bound by chains and stripped of all but their labor. To be a slave or prisoner in Assyria was to be trapped in a world where survival was measured not by freedom or hope, but by endurance through brutality, deprivation, and relentless control. Their lives, often erased from the triumphant inscriptions and royal annals, reveal the dark foundation upon which the empire's greatness was built. Slavery in Assyria was neither occasional nor marginal. It was a systemic institution, woven deeply into the economic, social, and military fabric of the empire. Conquests fueled the empire's expansion, but they also filled its coffers and its workshops with captive men, women, and children. These captives, ripped violently from their homelands, whether from the fertile plains of Babylonia, the distant hills of Urartu, or the rebellious cities of Israel, were marched in chains, a vivid spectacle of the empire's power and its ruthless efficiency. The march from battlefields to slave markets was a journey into dehumanization. Names were lost, languages silenced, and identities erased as prisoners were branded or tattooed to mark them as property. Some bore iron collars around their necks, others wore shackles on their wrists and ankles, each link a physical reminder of their bondage. These were not merely prisoners, they were tools and commodities to be traded, exploited, and discarded. For the average slave, life was a daily struggle against exhaustion, hunger, and pain. The empire demanded immense labor to maintain its vast infrastructure. The great canals, roads, and towering walls, the awe-inspiring monuments of Assyrian engineering, rose on the backs of enslaved laborers forced into backbreaking work. Under the blazing Mesopotamian sun, they tilled fields that fed armies, quarried stone for royal palaces, and dragged timber through muddy and treacherous terrain. In the cities, slaves worked in workshops, tending to metalworking or pottery, and in the homes of the elite, they performed domestic tasks, cooking, cleaning, childcare, yet their status remained unyieldingly low. They were not citizens. They had no voice in the city's life or its festivals. Their labor was exploited without compensation, their bodies expendable. The Assyrian kings, whose power was celebrated in massive reliefs and inscriptions, rarely acknowledged the suffering of these enslaved multitudes. Instead, their records speak proudly of victory and dominion, of capturing thousands and displaying them in triumphal processions. Such parades were psychological weapons. Slaves and prisoners, shackled and humiliated, were marched before cities and armies to crush the will of any who might oppose the empire. The message was clear. Resistance meant chains, exile, and loss of all dignity. Disease and malnutrition were constant companions. Slave quarters were cramped and unsanitary, breeding grounds for lice, infections, and deadly illnesses. Food was meager and often barely enough to sustain life, let alone the grueling labor demanded. Medical care, when it existed, was rudimentary and prioritized the elite. A slave with a festering wound was often left to suffer or die. Illness could quickly turn into death in such conditions, and the loss of a slave, while tragic, was seen as a mere economic setback. Punishments for any perceived disobedience were brutal and swift. The Assyrian legal codes permitted harsh penalties, from flogging to mutilation, and even death for slaves who resisted their masters or attempted escape. Flogging was common, leaving backs raw and broken, a physical reminder of submission. Mutilations, cutting off ears, noses, or tongues, served both as punishment and deterrent, marking the punished for life. These acts were not merely disciplinary, but also symbolic, reinforcing the total control wielded by masters and the empire. Escape was a near impossibility. The empire's soldiers and guards maintained strict vigilance along roads, cities, and slave labor sites. The vast Assyrian road network, while enabling commerce and military movement, also served as a tightly controlled system to monitor and contain human traffic. Runaways who were caught were tortured and publicly executed to set an example. Yet even in such oppressive conditions, human resilience flickered. Some slaves managed to carve out small spaces of agency through quiet acts of resistance, such as sabotaging tools, sharing information in secret, or preserving cultural practices. Certain slaves who served in elite households could learn trades or skills that improved their conditions, gaining small privileges or better food. Though rare, manumission was occasionally granted, freeing a slave for loyalty or other reasons, though the vast majority lived and died in bondage. Prisoners of war faced perhaps the harshest fate. Assyria's military campaigns were designed not only to conquer, but to terrorize and disarm entire regions. The empire's psychological warfare included the public execution of enemy leaders, often with their heads displayed on city walls or siege engines to intimidate foes. Common prisoners were sent to forced labor camps or sold into slavery. Deportation, moving entire populations from one region to another, was a favored tactic. It fractured social bonds, uprooted families, and aimed to extinguish resistance by erasing local identities and memories. Legally, slaves and prisoners were considered property, excluded from the protections granted to citizens. The empire's law codes made clear distinctions in status, denying slaves and prisoners any political rights or social privileges. They were under the absolute authority of their owners or the state, subjected to the whims of those who controlled their lives. Their bodies were tools of empire building, their spirits a subdued afterthought. Religious rituals and beliefs further reinforced the control over enslaved populations. The Assyrians believed that gods governed all aspects of life, including punishment for disobedience or rebellion. Fear of divine wrath was used as a tool of social control, both for free citizens and slaves alike. Enslaved peoples were often excluded from temple rites or had to serve in menial religious roles, their alien status marking them as spiritually lesser. Despite this grim reality, the lives of slaves and prisoners were the invisible scaffolding supporting Assyria's imperial might. Their forced labor maintained the empire's cities and armies, enabled agricultural productivity, and contributed to the wealth that enriched kings and nobles. Without them, the grandiose palaces and vast territories of Assyria would have crumbled. As we reflect on the lives bound by chains in this ancient empire, it becomes clear that their suffering was the unseen cost of imperial ambition. They endured unimaginable hardships, physical pain, hunger, isolation, and the constant threat of death or mutilation, yet their stories are rarely told. Their scars, both visible and hidden, tell of a harsh reality where survival itself was an act of defiance. To live as a slave or prisoner in the Assyrian Empire of Iron was to exist in a state of constant fear and subjugation. Freedom was a distant memory, dignity was fragile and easily shattered. Few could hope to endure even a single day under such conditions without succumbing to despair or destruction. In the shadow of the empire's soaring achievements and legendary military conquests, the chains that bound these countless lives remind us that history is never without its cost. Their endurance, suffering, and quiet resistance form a somber undercurrent beneath the gleaming surface of Assyrian power, a reminder that even the greatest empires are built on human lives, often broken and forgotten. The fall of Nineveh, the empire's twilight. The mighty city of Nineveh, once the beating heart of the Assyrian Empire, stands on the precipice of darkness, a final trembling moment before the collapse of an empire forged in iron and blood. For centuries, Nineveh's soaring walls, colossal palaces, and bustling streets symbolized Assyrian power and divine favor. But as the sun set on the empire's twilight, those walls that once promised safety became a prison for its inhabitants, a fortress slowly suffocated by siege and despair. To understand the fall of Nineveh is to witness the end of an era shaped by ambition and brutality, where the reverberations of empire, its rise and its fall, crashed down on millions. It was not a sudden downfall, but a slow, grinding collapse marked by internal strife, relentless external pressure, and the inevitable exhaustion of an empire stretched beyond its limits. By the late 7th century BCE, Assyria was a giant weakened by its own weight. For centuries, its armies had carved vast territories across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant, enforcing harsh rule through terror and iron discipline. But the cost of empire was immense. Prolonged wars drained resources and manpower. Rebellions simmered in the far-flung provinces, fueled by resentment and the unbearable yoke of Assyrian taxation and conscription. The people, commoners, slaves, soldiers, and nobles alike, felt the tightening noose of an empire losing its grasp. Nineveh, perched on the east bank of the Tigris River, remained a marvel of urban planning and architectural grandeur. Its broad avenues bustled with merchants, artisans, priests, and officials. The grand palace of King Sennacherib, decorated with intricate bas-reliefs depicting victories and divine favor, cast a long shadow over the city. Massive walls, stretching over 12 kilometers and rising more than 15 meters high, enclosed the city like the embrace of a colossus. But behind this grandeur lay cracks that deepened as the city prepared to face its greatest test. Around 612 BCE, a formidable coalition of enemies, Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, and others long oppressed by Assyrian might, joined forces in a historic rebellion. They marched on Nineveh, determined to shatter the iron grip that had ruled for centuries. The siege of Nineveh was brutal and protracted. Unlike the swift and ruthless campaigns Assyria had waged against its enemies, this time the attackers bore down on the capital with grim determination, encircling the city and cutting off its lifelines. The Tigris River, once a source of trade and life, became a battleground itself. The city's residents faced starvation and disease as supplies dwindled and desperation grew. Within Nineveh's walls, the population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was forced into survival mode. The city's wealthy elites and priests who once indulged in luxury and power now confronted the same stark realities as the common people. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, and the shadow of death lurked in every dark alley and crowded courtyard. Children cried from hunger, and the sick and elderly were left to perish, their bodies littering the streets. The Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, held out as a symbol of resistance, but even his authority waned in the face of overwhelming forces and dwindling morale. The once proud warriors who had terrorized their enemies were now trapped behind walls, cut off and vulnerable. In the narrow lanes, once filled with the clatter of carts and the chatter of merchants, silence fell like a shroud. The city's great temples, dedicated to gods like Ashur and Ishtar, where rituals once promised divine protection, became hollow. Priests performed desperate rites and sacrifices, hoping to turn the tide. But even their gods seemed silent or powerless. As days bled into weeks, the siege broke the spirit of Nineveh's defenders. The coalition forces breached the walls, whether through cunning, brute force, or treachery remains debated by scholars, but what followed was chaos and carnage. The invading armies poured into the city, looting, slaughtering, and razing palaces and temples alike. For the people caught inside, the fall was apocalypse. Families were torn apart, men, women, and children were killed or taken captive. The survivors, few and broken, faced the grim fate of slavery or exile. The streets that had echoed with life and power were drowned in blood and fire. The destruction of Nineveh was not only a military defeat, but a symbolic death knell for the Assyrian Empire itself. It marked the end of centuries of iron rule, the dissolution of a state that had held the ancient Near East in thrall. The empire's collapse created a vacuum, allowing new powers to rise, Babylon, Media, and later Persia. But the memory of Assyria's might lingered as a warning and a legacy. For those living through Nineveh's fall, survival was a daily battle against the cruel tide of history. The fall shattered their world, erasing their homes, families, and futures. The trauma rippled across generations, a harsh reminder of how empire building, for all its glory, was ultimately fragile and fleeting. Reflecting on Nineveh's twilight invites us to ponder the human cost behind the rise and fall of empires. Beneath the grandeur of kings and the spectacle of conquest lie the stories of ordinary people, caught in the crossfire of ambition and destruction, struggling to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. The ruins of Nineveh, buried beneath centuries of earth, whisper these stories to us now. They remind us that no empire, no matter how iron its hand, can hold forever. The fall of Nineveh is not just history, It is a mirror reflecting the fragile nature of power, the inevitability of change, and the resilience of those who live in its shadow. Legacy of the Iron Empire, influence on history and culture. The fall of the Assyrian Empire did not mark the end of its influence. Though the empire itself was shattered, its legacy endured, etched into the cultural memory, technologies, and political traditions of the ancient Near East and beyond. To understand why you wouldn't survive a day in the Assyrian Empire is to also grasp the profound ways in which this iron-fisted power shaped the course of history, long after its cities lay in ruins. Assyria's story is one of innovation and ruthless adaptation. It was an empire built on the mastery of iron, the very metal that gave it strength and superiority for centuries. Iron tools and weapons revolutionized agriculture, warfare, and craftsmanship, reshaping the everyday lives of countless people. The transition from bronze to iron was no mere technological upgrade. It was a profound shift that redefined power itself. Iron was harder to produce but more plentiful than bronze's tin and copper, enabling mass production of arms and tools, which in turn fueled the empire's expansion and administrative efficiency. But the Assyrians were not merely ironmongers. They were pioneers in statecraft and governance. Their innovations in administration, from centralized bureaucracy to a sophisticated postal system and road networks, laid the foundations for future empires. These developments enabled Assyria to control a vast and diverse territory, projecting power across mountains, rivers, and deserts. The roads that connected cities and provinces allowed for rapid communication and troop movements, an ancient precursor to the infrastructure that would characterize later empires. The artistic and architectural achievements of Assyria also left an indelible mark. The colossal palaces of Nineveh and Nimrud, adorned with intricate stone reliefs depicting scenes of war, hunting, and divine favor, conveyed messages of power and legitimacy. These artistic traditions influenced neighboring cultures and continue to inspire historians and archaeologists today. The Assyrian skill in sculpture, metallurgy, and construction showcased a civilization that balanced brutality with cultural sophistication. Religious beliefs and practices of Assyria, centered around a pantheon of gods such as Ashur, Ishtar, and Marduk, influenced later Mesopotamian and even broader Near Eastern spiritual traditions. Their emphasis on divine kingship, where the ruler was seen as chosen or favored by the gods, became a template echoed in subsequent empires. The rituals, myths, and iconography of Assyria filtered through time, shaping narratives of power, justice, and the divine right of rulers. The Assyrian Empire's legacy is also preserved in the writings of ancient historians and the biblical texts. Assyria is often portrayed as a symbol of imperial might and divine punishment, reflecting both fear and fascination. This complex image, born from Assyria's historical actions and its role in the broader geopolitical landscape, has influenced Western perceptions of empire and authority for millennia. Yet, beneath the grandeur and lasting influence lies the sobering reality of the Assyrian system, one built on terror, conquest, and relentless control. The empire's efficiency came at a tremendous human cost: forced migrations, brutal suppression of dissent, and the trauma inflicted on countless communities. Understanding this legacy means acknowledging that the advancements and stories that survived also carry the weight of suffering and resistance. As empires rose and fell across history, the Assyrian example served both as a warning and a lesson. It demonstrated the power of military innovation and centralized control, but also highlighted the limits of such power. The iron hand that built an empire could not hold forever, yet its imprint shaped the political and cultural landscapes long after the last king fell. Reflecting on Assyria's legacy invites us to see history as a continuum of human experience, where the echoes of ancient cities still resonate in modern concepts of governance, warfare, and culture. The Assyrian Empire may have collapsed, but its influence is woven into the fabric of civilization, reminding us that survival under iron rule was harsh, yet its stories endure as a testament to human ambition and resilience. Daily rituals, food, drink, and rest in a harsh world. Amid the relentless demands of empire building and survival in the Iron Age, daily life for the average Assyrian was a delicate balance of endurance and brief moments of respite. The harsh realities of warfare, taxation, labor, and social hierarchy weighed heavily on the people. Yet within this crucible of hardship lay modest joys and small routines that sustained them. To understand why you wouldn't survive a day in the Assyrian Empire is also to glimpse the rhythms of daily existence, the food they ate, the drinks they shared, and the fleeting rest they carved from their toil. Food was both necessity and ritual. The Assyrian diet, shaped by geography, climate, and status, was simple yet pragmatic. For the common folk, farmers, laborers, and artisans, the staple fare centered around barley, wheat, and legumes. Bread was a daily staple, often coarse and unleavened, baked in simple clay ovens or on heated stones. This bread, sometimes accompanied by pottages of lentils or chickpeas, provided the necessary calories for grueling labor. Vegetables like onions, garlic, cucumbers, and leeks added flavor and nutrition, though meat was a rarity for most, reserved primarily for festivals, religious offerings, or the wealthy elite. Meat, when available, was typically lamb, goat, or poultry, either roasted or boiled. The Assyrians were skilled hunters, and wild game occasionally supplemented their diet, but scarcity often dictated their choices. Fish from the nearby rivers and marshes was another source of protein, dried or smoked for preservation. Honey was prized as a sweetener, and olives provided oil not only for cooking but also for lighting lamps, weaving the threads of daily life with both sustenance and practicality. Drink, too, held cultural significance. Water, drawn from wells or the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was the basic necessity. But beer was the drink of choice, brewed from barley in communal spaces, offering not only hydration but also calories and mild intoxication. It was consumed daily by commoners and elites alike, often flavored with herbs or dates to improve taste. Wine was rarer, primarily enjoyed by the upper classes and reserved for feasts and religious ceremonies. Drinking was a social ritual, an occasion for storytelling, companionship, and temporary escape from the burdens of empire. Amid these food and drink rituals were moments of rest, both physical and spiritual. Sleep was precious but elusive, especially for those living under constant threat from war, disease, and social upheaval. The Assyrians recognized the importance of rest, but knew it was often a luxury. Families huddled together in mud brick homes with thatched roofs, sharing warmth and brief comfort in cramped quarters. The cold Mesopotamian nights could be unforgiving, and sleep was punctuated by watchfulness, whether for marauders or illness. In wealthier households, rest could be somewhat more elaborate. Cushions, mats, and woven rugs softened sleeping arrangements. Aromatic herbs might be burned to ward off insects or illness. The elite might enjoy private rooms and attendants, but even their rest was tinged with vigilance, as palace intrigues and political paranoia bred a tense atmosphere. Daily rituals extended beyond food and rest into small acts of preparation and care. Morning might begin with simple washing, the use of perfumes or oils, and the dressing in woolen or linen garments suited to the season and status. Hair and beard grooming were important markers of identity and respectability, with elaborate styles and oils used by the elite. These personal routines reinforced social hierarchies even in the smallest gestures. Religion and superstition infused daily life with additional rituals. Meals were often accompanied by prayers or offerings to household gods, seeking protection and favor. Small amulets or charms might be worn to ward off evil spirits, reflecting the deep interconnection between physical survival and spiritual belief. The fear of divine punishment or blessing was a constant presence, shaping even the simplest routines. Despite the relentless hardship, these daily rituals provided structure and meaning. They allowed individuals to assert some control over their environment, to find moments of joy and human connection in an otherwise brutal world. The communal sharing of food and drink reinforced bonds of kinship and community, while rest offered a brief reprieve from the demands of empire. Understanding these rhythms, the food, drink, rest, and rituals, is to understand the fragile humanity beneath the iron grip of Assyria. To survive a day in the empire meant enduring hardship, yes, but it also meant participating in these small acts that sustained life and spirit. The Assyrians, in their complexity, remind us that even under the harshest conditions, human beings seek nourishment, comfort, and meaning. Assyrian art and architecture, beauty amid brutality. In the heart of an empire forged in iron and fire Where war and conquest were woven into the very fabric of daily life, the Assyrians carved out not only a domain of power, but a world of art and architecture that communicated their identity, beliefs, and unyielding will. To walk among the grand palaces and massive stone reliefs of Assyria is to confront the paradox of beauty amid brutality, an artistic legacy as imposing and complex as the empire itself. The great cities of Assyria, from Ashur to Nineveh and Kalhu, were dominated by monumental architecture designed to awe and intimidate. Massive city walls, constructed from mud brick and reinforced with stone, rose high and wide, protecting the people within, but also symbolizing the empire's impenetrable strength. Gateways adorned with colossal lamassu, the mythical winged bulls with human heads, stood sentinel, guardians not only of the physical city, but of the Assyrian worldview itself. These hybrid creatures, combining strength, intelligence, and divine power, embodied the empire's belief in order imposed through force and the protection granted by the gods. Palaces, the seats of kings and governors, were the epicenters of Assyrian artistic and political power. Constructed from baked bricks, these sprawling complexes included throne rooms, courtyards, storerooms, and administrative offices, reflecting the complex bureaucracy that governed the empire. Yet what truly sets these structures apart are the extensive stone reliefs that covered their walls, immense slabs of alabaster and limestone, intricately carved with scenes of war, hunting, and divine authority. These reliefs were not mere decoration. They were carefully crafted visual narratives, designed to convey messages of dominance and control, to record military victories, and to reinforce the king's divine right to rule. One might see the king depicted as a mighty hunter, slaying lions with spear and bow, a metaphor for his power over nature and chaos. Other panels graphically portrayed siege warfare, soldiers scaling walls, enemies bound and led in chains, and cities burning. The raw intensity of these scenes was intended to instill fear and respect in all who viewed them, whether citizen or captive. But alongside these violent images were depictions of the gods and religious rituals, reminding viewers that Assyrian power was sanctioned from the heavens. Deities were often shown bestowing crowns, weapons, or blessings upon kings, a divine endorsement that transcended earthly authority. The delicate detailing of divine figures, the flowing robes and majestic postures, contrasted with the stark brutality of battle scenes, revealing a worldview in which the sacred and the savage were inseparably linked. Architecture itself was an expression of Assyrian values. Palaces were oriented to face rivers or significant roads, connecting earthly power with the flow of commerce and communication. Massive courtyards served as spaces for public ceremonies and displays of power, where the king could demonstrate his dominance not only over enemies, but also over his own people. The use of columns, grand staircases, and decorated doorways reinforced hierarchy and control, guiding visitors through spaces designed to impress and subdue. The urban landscape was punctuated by ziggurats, towering step temples dedicated to the gods, rising above the flat Mesopotamian plains. These religious monuments physically and symbolically connected heaven and earth, underscoring the empire's central belief in divine order. The ascent up the ziggurat was a pilgrimage through layers of cosmic and earthly power, reminding all who climbed that the gods stood at the pinnacle of authority. Assyrian artisans demonstrated extraordinary skill and craftsmanship. From finely carved ivories and intricate jewelry to detailed cylinder seals used for administrative purposes, their artistry blended utility with aesthetic elegance. These small portable works of art carried the same motifs of power, protection, and divine sanction found in the grander stone reliefs, making the language of authority and ritual accessible across all levels of society. Yet, for all their grandeur, Assyrian art and architecture were not expressions of mere vanity or beauty for its own sake. They were tools of psychological warfare and social control, integral to maintaining an empire that depended on fear, loyalty, and the constant demonstration of might. Every carved muscle, every imposing stone guardian, every depiction of conquest was a reminder that survival in Assyria demanded obedience and resilience. To live in such an environment was to be surrounded by constant reminders of power's price, the glory of victory shadowed by the terror of defeat. The empire's art spoke both to the hopes of immortality through legacy and the harsh realities of a world where violence was never far away. The legacy of Assyrian art and architecture endures not only in the fragments recovered by archaeologists, but in the echoes of a civilization that mastered the art of imposing order through spectacle and stone. Their creations challenge us to consider how beauty and brutality can coexist, how the human desire for meaning and control shapes the spaces we inhabit, and why perhaps surviving even a single day in their world was a feat of unimaginable courage. Cleanly formatted and ready to copy and paste. Punishment and justice, law in the Empire of Iron. In the vast and restless Assyrian Empire, justice was not a matter of mercy or fairness as we understand it today. Instead, it was a calculated instrument of power, a tool wielded by kings and officials to maintain control through fear, obedience, and unyielding discipline. To live under Assyrian law was to understand that the line between order and chaos was guarded by severe, often brutal punishment, a line crossed at one's own peril. Assyrian laws, preserved on clay tablets and inscribed with cuneiform, reveal a system that combined earlier Mesopotamian legal traditions with a particularly harsh and unforgiving character. Justice was public and absolute. The law served not only as a guideline for behavior, but as a mechanism to reinforce the empire's iron grip on its diverse and far-flung subjects. It was a regime where crimes were met with swift retribution, where punishment was designed to deter both the guilty and any would-be dissenters. The gravity of offenses ranged widely, from theft and deceit to rebellion and desertion, but the response was often disproportionate by modern standards. Theft, for instance, was punished not only by restitution, but also by the amputation of the thief's hand or fingers, a physical and permanent mark of guilt intended to warn others. This was justice made visible, etched on flesh as much as on tablet. Public executions and corporal punishments were commonplace, enacted in marketplaces or near city gates to maximize their impact as spectacle. The use of torture to extract confessions or punish crimes was accepted, a grim reminder that the state's authority was absolute. Crucifixion, flaying, and impalement were among the terrifying penalties employed, especially for those who dared to challenge the king's authority or threaten the stability of the empire. Slavery and forced labor were integral parts of this system. Those convicted of serious crimes or captured in war were often condemned to lives of brutal servitude, not merely as punishment, but as a means to fuel the empire's monumental construction projects and military campaigns. The enslaved lived under constant threat of harsh discipline, and their survival was uncertain. Yet, despite its brutality, Assyrian law was also surprisingly sophisticated in some aspects. Legal proceedings involved judges and witnesses, and contracts were meticulously documented. The laws addressed property rights, marriage, inheritance, and commercial transactions, reflecting the complexity of Assyrian society and economy. However, justice was unevenly distributed, with nobles and officials often enjoying privileges and leniency denied to commoners and slaves. The king himself was seen as the supreme judge, embodying divine authority to enact and enforce law. Royal decrees were absolute, and rulers maintained their power through a combination of fear, propaganda, and ritual. Laws were intertwined with religion. Offenses against the gods were met with particular severity, as such crimes threatened not only social order, but cosmic balance. This harsh legal environment shaped everyday life. People lived in constant awareness of the consequences of transgression. Fear permeated social relations, and trust was a fragile commodity. The law was a shadow looming over every transaction, every interaction, a reminder that survival depended on obedience, vigilance, and sometimes ruthless self-preservation. Punishment was also psychological. The public display of suffering and humiliation served as a deterrent, reinforcing social hierarchies and the supremacy of the state. Even children were taught to fear the law, learning from an early age the price of disobedience. To navigate Assyrian society was to accept a world where justice was not blind, but a weapon, wielded with precision and cruelty to maintain order. It was a system that valued stability over mercy, obedience over equity, and control over compassion. This legal landscape was as ironclad and unforgiving as the weapons that forged the empire itself. The legacy of Assyrian law is a stark reminder of how justice can serve power, and how survival within such a regime demands not only strength, but careful negotiation of a world ruled by fear and the relentless application of harsh consequences. Final reflection on survival. As the dust settles over the ruins of what was once one of the most formidable empires of the ancient world, we are left to ponder the true nature of survival within the Assyrian Empire of Iron. To survive even a single day amid the relentless pressures of this empire was an act of quiet courage, a fragile balance maintained between the harsh demands of an unforgiving state and the human spirit's stubborn refusal to be extinguished. The Assyrian Empire was a land forged in the crucible of conflict, ambition, and relentless expansion. It was an empire that stretched across vast territories, encompassing diverse peoples and landscapes, bound together not by consent, but by the iron hand of conquest and control. Life here was defined by extremes: harsh winters and blistering summers, moments of abundance overshadowed by famine, and fleeting glimpses of peace under the ever-present threat of war. Survival was a daily struggle, shaped by the unforgiving realities of the empire's social and political systems. The empire demanded obedience, labor, and sacrifice. From the lowliest farmer tilling the parched soil to the warrior on the battlefield, everyone was caught in a web of expectations that left little room for error or dissent. Taxes drained the peasantry, conscription emptied villages of young men, and the shadow of slavery loomed large over those who faltered or fell into debt. Yet, amid this harshness, there were moments of resilience and adaptation. Families clung to traditions and rituals that offered comfort and a sense of continuity. Communities banded together in the face of adversity, sharing resources and knowledge to endure famine, disease, and the dangers of siege warfare. The small miracles of daily life, a successful harvest, the birth of a child, a fleeting moment of rest, were treasured victories against the tide of hardship. The iron tools and weapons that defined the empire were double-edged symbols. They represented both the technological advances that allowed Assyria to dominate its neighbors and the brutal means by which it maintained order within. The same iron that built weapons of war also shaped plows that cultivated the land, reflecting the intertwined nature of creation and destruction in Assyrian life. Religion infused every aspect of existence, offering both hope and fear. The gods were protectors and punishers, their favor sought through elaborate rituals, sacrifices, and prayers. The fear of divine wrath was a powerful motivator, reinforcing obedience and social order, but also adding an additional layer of anxiety to an already precarious existence. Women, often confined behind the walls of their homes, navigated a world shaped by patriarchal norms, but found ways to exert influence and preserve family bonds. Children learned early that survival meant obedience and hard work, yet also discovered moments of joy and play that transcended their difficult circumstances. The military machine, infamous for its discipline and cruelty, was both a source of pride and terror. Soldiers were the empire's instruments of expansion and control, but they too faced the brutal realities of constant warfare, injury, and death. For many, the empire's glory was inseparable from its suffering. Justice in Assyria was harsh and uncompromising, a system designed to instill fear and maintain order through severe punishment. The law was not a safeguard of fairness, but a demonstration of power, a reminder that survival depended on submission to the will of the king and his officials. As the empire's iron grip eventually loosened and the great cities fell to ruin, the stories of those who lived through its height offer us valuable lessons. They remind us that survival is not merely about physical endurance, but about navigating complex social, political, and spiritual landscapes. It is about finding meaning in small acts of kindness and courage amidst overwhelming odds. The Assyrian Empire of Iron stands as a testament to humanity's capacity for both greatness and cruelty. It challenges us to reflect on the costs of power and the resilience required to endure it. To imagine a day in this empire is to step into a world where every breath is fraught with danger, yet where life in all its fragility and determination continues to flicker against the darkness. In the final reckoning, the empire's legacy is not only in its monumental architecture, its military conquests, or its innovations in iron technology. It lies also in the countless untold stories of individuals who, despite the weight of oppression, sought to survive, to love, and to hope. Their lives, though often marked by hardship, reveal the enduring spirit of humanity, a spirit that even the harshest empire could not fully extinguish. And so, as we close this chapter on the Assyrian Empire of Iron, we are left not just with images of brutality and power, but with a deeper understanding of survival itself, as a complex dance of fear, resilience, and the indomitable will to live, no matter the cost. Spies, scribes, and secrets, the empire's hidden backbone, the empire's hidden backbone. In the vast expanse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, where ironclad warriors and towering ziggurats dominated the landscape, an invisible force wove through the fabric of society. This force was not forged in fire or stone, but in the meticulous strokes of cuneiform on clay tablets and the whispered words of informants in shadowed corridors. The Assyrian Empire's true strength lay not only in its military might, but in its intricate network of spies, scribes, and secret keepers who maintained the delicate balance of power. The watchful eyes of the king. Assyrian kings, such as Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, understood that knowledge was as potent as the sharpest blade. They cultivated expansive intelligence networks to monitor both foreign adversaries and internal dissent. These networks were composed of trusted officials, informants, and covert agents who reported directly to the throne. The case of the Sassi movement exemplifies the empire's vigilance. In 671 to 670 BCE, conspiracies aimed at dethroning Esarhaddon emerged, involving high-ranking officials and rival claimants. The king's spy network uncovered these plots, leading to swift and brutal reprisals that quelled the insurrections and reinforced the king's authority. Scribes, the silent sentinels. At the heart of this information web were the scribes, the empire's silent sentinels. These individuals were more than mere record keepers. They were the architects of the empire's memory, documenting everything from agricultural yields to military campaigns. Their work ensured that the king remained informed about every aspect of his realm. The palace scribe, or Tupshar Akali, held a position of immense influence. Entrusted with managing the state archives and overseeing official correspondence, the palace scribe was a confidant of the king and a gatekeeper of information. Their responsibilities extended beyond administration. They played a pivotal role in shaping policy and maintaining the empire's stability. Communication, the lifeline of control. To maintain cohesion across its vast territories, the Assyrian Empire developed a sophisticated communication system. The King's Road, an extensive network of routes and relay stations, facilitated rapid transmission of messages and orders. This infrastructure allowed the central government to respond swiftly to emerging threats and ensured that provincial governors remained aligned with imperial directives. The power of information. In the Assyrian worldview, information was a tool of control and a means of asserting dominance. The empire's reliance on espionage and meticulous record-keeping underscored its recognition of the power inherent in knowledge. By maintaining a comprehensive understanding of both internal dynamics and external affairs, the Assyrian rulers could preempt challenges and reinforce their supremacy. A world without privacy. For the average Assyrian citizen, this omnipresent surveillance meant living under constant scrutiny. Conversations could be reported, movements monitored, and any deviation from expected behavior could attract unwanted attention. The pervasive nature of the empire's intelligence apparatus created an atmosphere where trust was scarce and caution was a daily necessity. Conclusion: the Assyrian Empire's legacy is often associated with its military conquests and architectural achievements. However, its true strength lay in the unseen mechanisms of control orchestrated by its spies and scribes. These individuals, operating behind the scenes, ensured the empire's longevity and cohesion. Their contributions, though less visible, were instrumental in crafting one of history's most formidable civilizations. To summarize, the Assyrian Empire of Iron was one of the most powerful and ruthless civilizations of the ancient world, a vast empire carved from the harsh landscapes of Mesopotamia and held together by iron weapons, relentless war, and an iron will. To survive even a single day in this empire was a challenge few could meet, as life was shaped by constant danger, brutal social structures, and a culture of fear. At its heart lay the city of Ashur, a bustling capital perched on the banks of the Tigris River. Markets overflowed with goods and the chatter of merchants, but beneath this vibrant surface lurked hunger, disease, and rigid social hierarchies that kept most people living in hardship. Commoners, farmers, artisans, and laborers were burdened by heavy taxes and the ever-present threat of conscription into the empire's feared military. Failure often meant falling into slavery, a brutal fate that stripped people of freedom and dignity. The Assyrian military machine was both the backbone and terror of the empire. Disciplined and ruthless, its soldiers mastered siege warfare and psychological terror, conquering and subjugating entire regions with iron weapons that gave Assyria a deadly advantage. War was not only a tool of expansion, but also a means of survival, keeping the empire's power intact through fear and violence. Life inside Assyrian fortresses and palaces was no refuge. Nighttime brought cold, darkness, and uncertainty. Sleep was scarce, and survival depended on constant vigilance against enemies and internal threats. Religion permeated every facet of Assyrian life. Gods were invoked as protectors and punishers, reinforcing social control through fear of divine wrath. Rituals and sacrifices were daily reminders of the gods' power, binding people to the empire's order. Women, though largely confined by patriarchal norms, wielded quiet strength within their homes, managing family affairs and enduring their own struggles. Children grew up quickly, learning early that survival required obedience and labor. Education was reserved for the elite, while poorer children faced dangerous work and a precarious future. The empire demanded heavy tribute and taxes from conquered peoples, often fueling famine and hunger as resources were diverted to war efforts. Siege warfare brought starvation, disease, and despair to besieged cities, breaking both the bodies and spirits of the inhabitants over time. Assyrian art and architecture, massive stone reliefs and imposing palaces, revealed a worldview that glorified power, conquest, and the king's divine right to rule. Yet beneath this grandeur lay a legal system marked by harsh laws and brutal punishments, designed to maintain order through fear and submission. Despite its might, the empire eventually fell, its capital Nineveh destroyed, and its people scattered. Yet the legacy of the Assyrians lived on, through their innovations in iron technology, their military strategies, and the stories of resilience and survival from those who endured their empire's iron grip. Ultimately, the Assyrian Empire of Iron was a place where survival was not guaranteed but earned through courage, adaptation, and an unyielding will to live. It reminds us of the complex interplay between power and humanity and the enduring spirit that persists even in the darkest of times.